Good morning. This is Heather from NYSED. Let me just check and make sure. Let's see. Can everybody see the slides? Looks like you can. All right. So here we are in Albany. This is the CBT Proctor webinar. We have a webinar. We're going to share some tips, best practices, things that we've heard from other schools for how they are proctoring and running proctoring. And one thing that we shared during the winter CBT training sessions is the concept of a command center model. And we'll go into that a little bit, but I just want to kind of like start off with that description. The command center model is an idea, and our schools in New York State, they developed this last year and shared it with us. And so we've been also sharing this with others in the state, is that you have active proctoring in the classroom, where your proctors may not have access to Nextera admin, which again is a local decision, but they're actively proctoring the students. They're walking around, they're there, they're available for the students. They're not sitting behind computer screens, which is totally fine, but just the concept of you got the active proctors in the classroom, then out in the hallways, you have technical colleagues.
Yeah, I have watched
Helene, we can hear you.
It's not.
Hold on a second.
Actually.
Helene.
There are folks, if you are not on mute, please make sure that you are muted.
Okay. And are we recording?
We are recording.
Great. Now everyone's going to hear that in the recording, so good. Anyhow, so we've got technical colleagues that are out in the hallway that are on call, right? They're watching the Nextera admin screens. They're seeing if students are offline, online. Additionally, they're there if, say, there's something wrong with a computer. Maybe a mouse isn't working. And the proctor, the active proctor in the testing location can walk out into the hallway and take that mouse and get it replaced, right? With focusing on having as little disruption in the classroom as possible for those students that are testing on CBT. And then on top of that, you've got a central command center where the principals may be watching the Nextera admin screens. They may be watching the students in progress, the building level users, the school test coordinators, right? So just there are a lot of different ways that schools can organize proctoring with CBT. And we want you to be able to know that you can be flexible, right? That it can be arranged differently. But with that, we're going to lead in to first. So Christy Tooker from Questar is going to walk us through most of the training today. And then so that you know, we have colleagues sitting here around our large conference table in room 875 at NYSED, and we'll answer your questions if you want to chat them at us. And then Christy, you want to tell them about where the presentation is first?
Yes, so a couple of housekeeping items are the presentation is posted on CBT support. You can get that by going to cbtsupport.nysed.gov. And then also, if you have questions, you'll see a questions box. As Heather said, that we will be answering those questions throughout the morning as we go along. If we have time at the end, we will ask for folks to raise their hands and we can actually have some live conversation. We'll see how the time takes us. Also, I did get a question in here that we were having trouble hearing everything okay. Just for our own purposes, if you are having absolutely no problem hearing me, can a couple of you just raise your hand just so I know that everyone is hearing okay? Perfect. I do see some hands raised. Thank you, everybody. So from there, we will then get started. So my name is...
Oh, okay. Yeah, I see that. There was a lost volume for a moment. Okay. Everyone can hear me. Oh, okay. Go on. Sorry.
So again, my name is Christy Tooker, and I am the Technical Readiness and Sustainability Consultant at Questar. And I will be taking you through a good portion of the morning, and Heather will jump in with some tips and best practices as we go. So our agenda for today, the target audience, first of all, for this presentation are teachers and other educators who will be proctoring the 3 through 8 ELA and math computer-based tests this spring. In this training, we will cover what the role of the proctor is for CBT, We will also go through an overview of operational testing. And then we will go through preparing for test day. And in that section, we'll talk about CBT technology readiness, preparing your exam rooms, preparing your students, Nextera admin. And then we will talk about administering the tests. So the materials that you will need for testing, how to proctor computer-based tests, monitoring student progress, and of course, the student experience. Following that, we will talk about what needs to occur after testing. And then Heather will go through some of the tips and best practices that we heard from last year. So the proctor role for CBT is very similar to the role of paper-based testing. It's important to manage security in the testing room environment is the focus. So proctors must follow all security protocols when supervising the.
Some people can't still hear us. So,
right.
So Michael Thompson says he can't hear us. We want you to hear us. So let us look into this and go to meeting. In the meantime, we'll let you know that the teacher's directions are coming soon for CBT. We hope to post them by this Friday, but the way that you'll know when they are posted is that we'll announce that on CBT support. So if you want to subscribe to CBT support, what you would do is you need to have an account and you need to click the follow link on every section on CBT support. And then you'll be alerted when new content's posted. So Christy, what do you think?
So for those of you who cannot hear us, you won't know that I'm saying this, but try logging out and logging back in. That is a network issue, as there are quite a few of you who can hear us. So we are going to continue the morning. This is recorded. If anybody does continue to have technical difficulties, you can hear this at a later date. So I'm going to pick up where I left off. So, yep. So again, what is the role of the proctor for CBT? Again, proctors must follow all security protocols when supervising the test administration. It's important to circulate periodically around the room during the administration of each session of the test to ensure that students are not having difficulty navigating within the online test form. It's also important to make sure that your students are recording their multiple choice and constructed response answers in Nextera test delivery system. We don't want students leaving their answers on their paper if they have scratch paper next to them. So it's really important that you're putting all of that information right into the online system. Before a student submits the test, you can point out to students if they have left one or more answers blank on the review and submit screen, and I'll show you what that looks like in the coming slides. It's also important that proctors do not comment to the student on the correctness or sufficiency of any answer. We'll go over the proctor pin and the whole process in the coming bit, but I do want to point out that there are some things very specific with computer-based testing. It's called the proctor pin. This is the most significant difference between paper-based testing and computer-based testing. The proctor must assist a student who has paused the test with accessing his or her online test with the proctor pin. This is secure material. And again, a proctor should be entering that proctor pin onto the student's device if for any reason the student does pause their test. And I'll go through that process when we get into the student experience. But this is something that all proctors should have available to them prior to the beginning of each session. The proctor should also be familiar with all the Nextera test delivery navigation features, as well as how to tell if student's testing device is online or offline while the student is testing. And these are just a couple of different functionalities that the student has and that you should be familiar with. And we'll go through again the entire student experience in full when we get to that point. This is an example of what the review and submit screen looks like. So when the student gets to the end of their test, they will have the ability to click on unanswered or answered, and you as the proctor will be able to point out to them if they did leave something unanswered. So the proctor should be familiar with this review and submit screen. in the Nextera test delivery system in order to assist students with identifying unanswered test questions. And I'll show you where that falls for a student when we get to that point in the student experience.
Can I answer a question real quickly?
Yes.
So there's a really good question that came in from Craig Stanton, and I just want to make sure that it's clear that the Proctor pin is building specific. Okay, so it's not classroom specific, it's not testing location in Nextera admin. So every school building has its own pin, so every building within a district. And all of those are available on the Nextera admin homepage, and the DTC, for instance, or the STC can see those now. They're already posted. Okay. All right, take it away, Christy. Thanks.
So next we'll go over an overview of the operational CBT test. So for CBT, there are secure test administration requirements as with paper-based testing. There are 2 test sessions this year within a 6-day administration window. That gives you the flexibility to repeat session 1 and 2 3 different times. There's a 3-day makeup window. An entire grade should be scheduled for primary administration on the same 2 consecutive days. Multiple students can use the same device if students submit the test at the end of each session. For ELA, the administration dates are April 10th to April 17th, which is just right around the corner. Makeup dates, April 13th to the 20th, and scoring dates, April 16th to May 3rd. For math, the administration dates are May 1st to May 8th, with makeup dates until the 11th and scoring dates May 4th to May 16th. So there's a couple of platforms that we'll be discussing today. Nextera Admin is the online test administration system. This is the behind the scenes for student testing. This is where you would set up your accommodations and get your login ticket. It's multi-tiered and role-based, and this is ultimately where you go in to manage your students and your student test taking. Another system that we'll be talking about in full today is the Nextera test delivery system. You'll often hear us talk about the secure browser. This is a download onto each student's device. So the students will access their test by clicking on this download, this icon that they'll see on their computer screen to access the test. They'll have their credentials, which is their NICES ID and password. And then there's a couple different layers of security to actually access the test that we'll go through. There's also additional practice with previously released state questions in the test delivery system. And ultimately, again, this is where students access and complete the test. It's also important to note ScorePoint. It's not on this slide, but ScorePoint is Questar's software application to score written and constructed response items entered by students during the computer-based testing. We will not be talking about that today. But just so that you're aware, all CBT responses are scored online through ScorePoint. So the next section we will be talking about is preparing for test day. We'll go over CBT technology readiness, preparing your exam room and your students, and then we'll go through some of the key things that you'll need to know in Nextera admin, such as accessing student login tickets, session access codes, and the Proctor pin. So on the day of testing, and even up until this point, your information technology coordinators are most likely the folks that are setting up the computers to make sure that they have the secure browsers downloaded for the students to take the test. So it's important that you're working with your IT group to make sure that the devices are ready for testing. Make sure you have enough devices for students. Make sure you have external keyboards and mice that are working. Be sure to check those batteries. Confirm that the Nextera test delivery system has been installed and tested on all student devices. And then consider additional hardware you may want to have on hand, such as additional devices and extra power strips. In preparing your exam room, it's important to provide a well-lit, well-ventilated, and quiet classroom. Ensure that all devices have been set up with the Questar secure browser. And direct any questions to your school's technical support. Make sure all your computers are fully charged and, if possible, plugged in. Also, plan your seating arrangements. Allow enough space between students to prevent sharing of answers. A seating chart or other record of student device assignment is recommended in the event that a situation requires a student to leave and return to a device. You can also consult Appendix W of the SAM for tips on how to set up your CBT testing room. In preparing your students, it's important to help the students approach testing in a relaxed and positive way. Encourage and motivate your students to put forth their best effort. Be sure students understand the directions and have practice with the New York State question sampler, and the URL is listed there. You can also access this by going to Google and typing in New York State NYS question sampler, and you'll be able to access the link that way as well. This is also available in the secure browser. As I spoke of earlier, are 3 practice tests for each grade and subject to further familiarize students with the testing experience. Encourage students to attempt all questions. Tell them to read each question carefully and make their best attempt at answering each one. As the proctor, you should discuss proctoring for CBT ahead of the testing window to determine how exactly your school will organize proctoring in conjunction with Nextera admin. Will the focus on active proctoring within the classroom? Will the focus be on technical proctors who are accessing Nextera admin within the classroom?
Yep. So this gets back to the command center model that we were discussing at the beginning of the Proctor webinar. So these kind of decisions, because proctoring for CBT is very similar to PBT, but also there's this additional layer with Nextera admin. The school needs to have these conversations with proctors and decide, what is the model we're going to follow? How are we going to organize that? And if you have any questions, you can ask your RIC, because every RIC testing center has experience with CBT operational from last year, or you can send questions into NYSED. But we want you to have those real conversations and figure out what you're going to do. And even on top of that, we've had a lot of districts that have run a CBT simulation, right? So nuts to bolts. They even hand out phony little login tickets for the secure browser practice test to figure out how many proctors would they need, in the classroom. What is the best model? And it's so neat to hear this. They a lot of the districts, when they do this, they share feedback with us. And we find out that they actually made decisions related to proctoring based on what went down in the CBT simulation. So it's just an idea to share with you folks. Thanks.
So with that being said, it is a local decision as to whether or not the teacher or proctor have access to Nextera admin. For this presentation, we are assuming that the proctor or teacher will be logging into the administration system. But again, that's a local decision. We will go through the steps to prepare CBT for the testing day within Nextera admin. So to access Nextera admin, you would be contacting your district test coordinator or your principal in the district or school and ask them to create and activate your account. So again, this is a local decision. Every district or school can make their own decisions as to whether you do want proctors and teachers to be able to log into Nextera admin to prepare for testing, or if that's something that you'll be doing at a higher level. So once you have your login credentials, you can sign in to Nextera admin. This is an example of what the home screen looks like. The home screen contains high-level information about your school. NYSED will keep users updated on important information from this page. Users should always review this page for updated information. One of the most important pages within Nextera admin is the test page. So each student will need login credentials in order to log into the test session. To log it, teachers may print student login credentials as labels to distribute to the students. But again, this is a local decision who is going to be doing this task at your district or school. If you are unsure as to whether or not you should print your login credentials, ask your school test coordinator. And it's really important to remember that login credentials and session access codes are secure materials. Student login credentials are the same for both test sessions, but the session access codes are different for sessions 1 and 2. So to access those tests, the login tickets, you go to the test tab. You click on view next to the applicable class or test, and then select login tickets as you saw here with the arrow being pointed to the login tickets button. Then you have a choice of printing those labels on 2 different types of Avery labels or in a student roster format. Once you click OK, those labels will show as a PDF on your device, or whether it's a label, they'll show in a grid format. And then you can use the print function to print those logins and distribute to your students. Now, in the school administrator's manual in Appendix Y, we do have tips for troubleshooting if you are having problems having your login tickets line up appropriately. So on this page here, I do have those tips listed for you, but again, you can find that information in the school administrator's manual in Appendix Y. The session access code is something that we'll talk about too, but this is a required 4-digit code that the teacher will provide to the students during the administration of the field test. And I'll show you where all of this falls into play when we get to the student experience. But in order to be sure that you as a proctor or a teacher have the materials that you need ready for you, this is where you get those access codes. So if you click on, again, you're going to your same test tab where the login tickets are available. You'll see just below the login tickets button that there's a session 1 access code, and then there's a session 2 access code. These are 4 digits, and they are different per class. So if you, let's say, have 3 different classes that are set up in Nextera Admin for your ELA grade 3 students, each of those classes will have a unique session 1 access code and then a different session 2 access code. So it's important that you have that information available to you prior to testing. And again, let's talk about the Proctor pin. The Proctor pin is needed anytime a student pauses or exits out of the test. This is a secure material that should be provided to you in the materials packet on the day of testing. If not, proctors would need to contact their district test coordinator or their school test coordinator to obtain the Proctor pin. This information is located on the DTC or STC's homepage. So this is just a snippet of what the homepage looks like. And under the school information section, you'll see the district listed if you're a district test coordinator. And then each school will have a Proctor pin. So if you have 5 schools within your district test coordinator will have 5 different Proctor pins that you'll need to provide to each of your proctors in the room. Each school does have a unique Proctor pin. So during the next section, we're going to talk about administering the tests, the materials for testing, proctoring the computer-based tests, monitoring student progress. I'll show you some different screens within Nextera Admin that are great to view during testing. And then, of course, we'll walk through the student experience if you're unfamiliar with that as well. So here's a quick little checklist for you. Teachers or proctors will need the proper tools for a successful administration on computers. Student login tickets, which we already talked about. Each student will have a different set of credentials, so each student will have a NYSIS ID and a password to log into the test. Once they log in, they will see either to go to session 1 or session 2. And the only way that they can get into each of those sessions is if they have the correct access code for those sessions. And that's something that you as the proctor or the teacher will have at your own discretion. You'll be able to provide that to them. It's a 4-digit code that you'll say out loud so that they can then type it into their device when the time comes. The Proctor pin, and again, this is something that only you should have. You should only have this information, and you should be the ones typing that into the student's device if it's needed. It's important to also have the teacher's directions. Each student can have scrap paper. What are the rules for scrap paper?
That's a good question. All right, so the rules for scrap paper are for ELA, all students are provided with one piece of lined scratch paper, and the proctor must have additional pieces on hand to provide to the students. When the students put their hand up, then they request another piece of scratch paper. Students can accumulate as much scratch paper as they ask for, and that scratch paper is not taken away from them until the end of the test. The scratch paper is not scored. It is collected to be securely destroyed only. And for math, students are provided with two pieces of scratch paper, one piece of one piece of unlined scratch paper, and one piece of graph paper. Same rules about putting their hand up and asking for more.
Thanks, Heather. And then for math, not only is there a calculator provided actually on the computer in the test, but you can also, it's important that the students have their school-provided calculators next to them for their use as well. And there's also a math reference sheet, both online, and the student will have a paper version as well. And more detailed information is in the teacher's directions that were just posted. Proctors must follow all security protocols when supervising the test administration. It's important to circulate periodically around the room during the administration, just as you would for a paper-based test. Make sure students are recording their answers in the test delivery system. On the review screen, point out to students if they have left one or more answers blank. Do not comment to students on the correctness or sufficiency of any answer. And do not use cell phones or other photographic devices to duplicate test materials. Never take photos of the operational test, even if there is an issue that you need to report to NYSED or Questar. It's also really important that the proctor is familiar with the test accommodations set in Nextera admin for the students in the room. It's important that proctors verify all student accommodations and alternate language settings before the testing starts. If students do not have the correct accommodations or languages prior to testing, a form reset will be required. Examples of that are text-to-speech, read aloud, and the translations. So this is a list of the different accommodations as well as the alternative languages that are available in Nextera admin for the students to use for testing if their IEP or 504 plan allows. And the alternative languages are Chinese, Haitian, Creole, Korean, Russian, and Spanish. So I want to talk a little bit about each of the accommodations. For the answer masking tool, this is an accommodation that allows for the responses to be shaded so the responses do not distract the focus of the student from the question. In order to reveal or hide a response option, the student clicks on the eye next to that option. And all of these accommodations, as well as the alternative languages, are available in the question sampler. So while I may just go over them briefly now, as a proctor or teacher, it's really important that you do understand these and you can see those right in the question sampler. So the background color accommodation allows the color of the background to be changed as needed in order to make the text easier for the student to read. There are multiple color options available. There's also an initial page zoom accommodation that enlarges the text and the images on the screen so that the student can view or read the text more easily. This is just a preset that can be adjusted by the student as needed. The 5 alternative languages I already spoke of, but also—
Wait, stop real quickly.
Yep.
So everyone's looking for the test tab on Nextera admin that we just went over.
Oh, good point.
It's not available yet. So the test tab is the super secure spot, right, with the access codes and the ability to print login tickets. It will be available tomorrow on March 22nd. Okay, so you won't see it now, but you will see it in the morning, and that'll be fun for everyone. And at that point, folks can print ELA or math login tickets But we want to remind everybody about secure materials, right? If you're printing those login tickets this early, they must be stored in the safe or the vault of the school, okay? Login tickets are only distributed, taken out of that safe the morning of the test session to which they're associated.
Thanks,
Okay?
Heather.
Yep.
So just getting back to some of the accommodations, the reverse contrast is an accommodation that changes the color of the text and the background for students that have an easier time reading white text on a black background. And then text-to-speech and read aloud we'll talk about on the next slide. Heather, I'm going to pass off to the slide for you to go over. So there's 3 different accommodations: test read, which is a paper-only accommodation, and then there's 2 computer-based accommodations, which are read aloud and text-to-speech.
Sure. All right. So test read, as Christy said, is our paper-only. It's a paper-only accommodation. But the way that we want you to think about it is test read is the testing accommodation. That's what most schools are going to see on students' IEPs or 504 plans. Read aloud and text-to-speech, those are the computer Nextera admin components for delivering the test read accommodation on computers. Read aloud by human is new this year. It's new and we're providing it by popular demand. Last year we heard from a lot of schools and districts that students do tests on computer with a human reader. So if your students are going to use a human reader, yet they're going to enter their responses into the Nextera test delivery system, then you will set the testing accommodation for that student read aloud by human. This ensures that that student is being delivered Form A. All our specials in the testing world are called Form A. They're identified as Form A. That includes Braille, large print, text-to-speech, or test read, as well as the alternate language exams. And what this means is that by setting Form A, read aloud by human for that student in Nextera admin, you're ensuring that your human reader is going to have the same test form and paper to read to the student, right? They're both going to have Form A. Likewise, with text-to-speech, you are setting that accommodation for the student, and the student's going to be using most likely headphones, unless the student's in a single location testing alone. And the student's going to listen to the robots read the test to her or him. They're going to have the ability to control the text-to-speech player, and that student is still testing on Form A. It is really important that all schools know exactly how the test read accommodation is going to be delivered to their students ahead of sitting for the test, ahead of logging into it. And we'll go over in some tips and best practices, some things that we learned from last year that we can advise you about this year. But checking accommodations and making sure that your students have those accommodations is super important before they sit for the test. Okay. Thanks, Christy.
So in talking about text-to-speech, it's important to be familiar with this functionality. So again, you can access this in the question sampler to see this player and make sure that you do understand its functionality. It is controlled by the student. The student must click play on each, let's say, passage or test question or answer. The text-to-speech player can be moved around on the screen. The text is highlighted on the screen as the test is read. There are 4 reading speeds, and also the device has to be set for volume prior to logging into the secure browser. Once the student logs in, the volume buttons are disabled, so that's a really important tip right there. Proctors will also need to know what is read to the student via the computer and what is not, and that's according to their IEP or 504 plan. So this is an example of what the player looks like on the bottom. Also, proctors should be familiar with the text-to-speech features available under a right click of the mouse click. One of those examples is a play from here functionality. So on this page here, this is the testing status details page, and you get to this by going to tests and then clicking on testing status details. This is a page that is available now. And this is a great place that you can see an overview of student testing by your district or your school, depending on your role, as well as different contents or a specific class. Another important spot to pay attention to is on that test page that will be available at the end of the week. There are, at the bottom of the page where you see the student's last name, their first name, and their ID information, there's a column there for the connection status. And as a proctor or teacher who has access to this page, you would be able to see if a student is offline for any reason, if there's something wrong with their device. So that's a great spot to pay attention to as well. You'll also see on the same page, there's timestamps and number of items completed. This is updated in real time about every 60 seconds or so. So this is a great place to monitor student progress. You'll also see that there's a couple of buttons here. One's pause all tests and one is just pause test by student over on the right. So an example of why you might use this functionality, let's just say, for instance, unfortunately a student gets sick during the test and they just need to get to the nurse's office. If you need to pause their test for them rather than going to their device, you can do that by just clicking pause text next to their name, and it would pause the test for that student. You'll also see the pause all test functionality. And an example for this is, let's say there's a fire drill and all the students are getting out of the building and you just want to quickly click on that pause all test, you can do that. And again, that's not a requirement, it's just a functionality that you do have. So in monitoring student progress, there's also something called the examiner view. The examiner view is an option within Nextera to allow a proctor or a teacher who does not otherwise have access to Nextera to be able to monitor student testing. So for a user who does have access, you would first go to that other educator's computer. So let's say I'm the school test coordinator, and for the purpose of testing, I do want my proctor or teacher in the room to be able to access that test page during testing just to see and monitor student progress from behind their own device. So that that school test coordinator would go to that teacher or proctor's computer and log into Nextera admin. They would then go to the test tab and click on test and locate the applicable class that they want their proctor to view and click on view. And then just above the login tickets, there's a button called examiner view. Once you click on the examiner view button, it opens up a new tab. The administrator would then go back to the other tab and log out of Nextera admin. And what that does is it leaves the proctor with just the test page and the ability to see student progress in real time. And this is an example of what the examiner view would look like. So it's basically exactly what the test page looks like with the access codes available there, as well as your ID information, your timestamps and your items completed, etc. So that's another way that you can monitor student progress. So in talking about the student experience, students will log into their testing device on the day of testing using their school-provided username and password first. So that's the first access point. You actually need to get into the device. Every school is set up a little differently, so maybe you don't have passwords to get into your devices. But that is the first access point. Next, the student will log into Nextera Test Delivery a laptop or an iPad, for example, they'll see this icon, and this is the Questar Secure Browser. So students access the test delivery system through that secure browser, which will be downloaded to the workstations by technology coordinators. Students then double-click the Questar Secure Browser icon to launch the Nextera test delivery system. Students cannot access outside websites while using the secure browser. So once they click on that icon, the secure browser page opens, and they'll see a sign-in page. This is where, using their provided credentials, students enter their NISIS ID and password, in the applicable fields and click Sign In. You'll also see that there's an eye icon, an eyeball, in the password. This allows the student to unmask their password. So if they're having trouble typing in their password, they can click on that icon and it'll actually show them the letters and numbers that they're typing as they type them. Then they'll go to the verification screen. So as the students click through, they sign in, they need to verify that this is the information that they see on the screen is them. So they want to make sure that they see their name, the correct grade level, that they are taking ELA, their date of birth, etc. If they see the correct information here, there's no problems. They click on yes, and they continue going through the directions for computer-based testing. If for some reason there's an error on that verification screen, there's a couple of different scenarios where a student could continue testing versus where they should absolutely stop and get it fixed before continuing testing. So in instances where it's just an incorrect spelling of the name or an incorrect date of birth, that's something that absolutely should be fixed, but it doesn't prevent the student from testing. So the student, it's important that they, of course, raise their hand and let the proctor know, but that can be fixed at a later time. The proctor or teacher can advise the DTC and have them fix that after testing, but you can at that point advise the student to continue testing. In instances where there's a completely wrong name, it's absolutely not you, and it's absolutely not your correct grade level. Let's say you see a grade 3 versus a grade 7, stop testing. We want to be sure that the students are taking their test and their correct grade level. So the students, first of all, the first line of defense is make sure that they were given the right login ticket. That could have just been a simple mistake that can be fixed right then and there. So be sure that they have the right login ticket in, and if it's even worse than that, they just need to get something fixed on the back end. Contact customer support, and we'll work with you and NICED to make sure that this is fixed before testing. So in the instance where everything is okay and the student does click on yes, they'll then be brought to the test selection page. This page, once the student completes the verification, they choose the test that they are going to be taking that day. So let's say I'm the proctor in the front of the room and I say, everybody click on Start Test next to Session 1. So everyone clicks on Start Test next to Session 1. Now the student, if they were to click on Session 2, they cannot move forward without the correct access code. And in a couple more steps, you'll see that it will prevent them from taking the wrong session. So we all know that, you might have that student in the test or in your classroom that's trying to get ahead of you, but that can't happen without that access code. So that's really why it's really important to have 2 different access codes, obviously, for the 2 different sessions. So you click on Start Test next to Session 1, and then from there, the student is brought through the directions. Once the student selects the test directions display, and they'll use the right arrow to walk through the test directions. You as the proctor in the front of the room will have the teacher's directions in front of you, and you'll be reading to them as they're following the prompts on their screen. So they use the forward-facing arrow on the right to move forward the directions. So the directions on this window explain how to determine this particular window if there's an internet connectivity or a computer being used for testing. So you'll see here, I'm going to talk about each of these buttons as we go. So there's an online/offline indicator for the student. If the student is online, they will see a green check mark. If the student for some reason is offline, they'll see a red X. So they do have an indicator in the upper left corner of their page to know whether they're working online or offline. And obviously, it might be important to note to your students if they see that red X to raise their hand so that you as a school or district can manage that appropriately. A couple other buttons that the student will see when they get to the main page is the directions and pause sign out button. So you would press the directions link if you want to bring up these directions again for any reason. And then the pause sign out button, if let's say you need to run to the restroom, the student can pause the test and then re-enter it when they return. So I'll go through that step in a moment. So going through the directions more, It'll also talk about the review screen. So when the student gets to the end of the test, they'll click on the review screen to make sure that they have indeed answered all of the questions. And then it'll also talk about moving between questions. That's in the upper right-hand corner, and I'll show you this all in perspective in just a moment. For ELA, there is a split screen control down the middle of the page. So the passage would be on the left side of the page, and the questions and answers would be on the right side. If a student wants to see the passage in a larger view, they can click on the right arrow, so it would make the left side of the page larger, and vice versa. If they want to make the question and answer larger, you can click on the left side to make that the right pane larger. So they have that ability on ELA exams to do that. A couple of other buttons, and again, these are buttons and functionality that's available to all students. The accommodations are extra, so everybody has the zoom in and zoom out. They also have a bookmark or a note tool. So if a student, let's say for the bookmark, they get to number 3, they want to think about it for a moment, so they would just bookmark it. And then let's say they get to the end of the test. When they get to the review screen, it'll actually show them that they bookmarked number 3, so it will remind them to go back to look at that question again. And the note, same thing. If let's say you're in ELA and you want to work on your constructor response in the notepad, you have that ability to do that. But just know it's really important to tell your students that all of their final answers do need to be in the constructor responses. The notes are not saved or scored. Some other directions and tools that the student might see: a highlighter tool. For math, they might see a ruler, a calculator, or a protractor. There's also an answer eliminator tool. This tool can mark your answers. You can click on it and they would put a red X through the answers. So it would just eliminate that as a visual for the student. And then there's also a line reader in ELA where you can block certain parts of the test so you can focus on a portion at a time. When the student gets to this window, you'll either hit End Directions or X. And at this point, it will ask you for that session access code. So it's really important at this point that you would then read that 4-digit code out loud. So if it's 1, 2, 3, 4, for instance, then all of the students in that particular class will have the same access code. So they would all just type in 1, 2, 3, 4 and hit continue. And again, remember, the session 2 is a different access code. So if a student accidentally clicked on session 2, they won't be able to access the test at this point. So again, make sure that you have those access codes ready for testing, because it's important for the student to be able to get into the test. They'll then see the next window that says wait to start. And at that point, you can hit start test according to when the proctor or teacher tells you to hit start test. I want to take a second to talk about staggering student start times. So it is a best practice to stagger student start times if you're in larger than, let's say, a classroom size setting. If, let's say, you're working in like a gymnasium with hundreds of students, it's important that you are staggering your students about every 30 students or so in 2 to 3 minute intervals. And this flow chart shows you where indeed you need to stagger that start time. And it's not when you click start test just one slide ago. It's actually back here where it says choose your test. So I'm going to go back to that page. When you are at this point, when the students are hitting session 1 or session 2, this is where you need to be staggering student start time in order to avoid any, let's say, internet connectivity issues or bandwidth problems. So again, it's not when you hit wait to start. It's not when you're typing your access code. It's at this point that you're choosing your test session that you need to hit start test. So once the student hits the start test, the first thing they'll see is the cover page. They'll also see the tips and sources. It's also a really great stopping point at this point to make sure that all of your students are indeed seeing the correct content and grade level of the test that they are supposed to be taking that day. And then next you get it right into the test. So after you go through the cover page, the test, and this the test page sources and tips, you'll be brought right into question number 1. And again, if you're not familiar with this, I highly suggest that you get out in the question sampler and take a look. But just to put into perspective where all of those different buttons are that I just talked about, you'll see the online, offline indicator in the upper left-hand corner. In the upper right-hand corner, if a student needs to bring up those directions because they forget how a certain tool works, they can click on directions again. And then, of course, there's a pause sign out that I'll talk about what needs to happen if a student does pause or sign out in just a moment. The arrows here on the right, just below the sign out, is the to move forward and backward in the test. So to go to question number 2, you would hit the forward arrow, and to go backwards, you would hit the reverse arrow. When a student gets to the end of a test, this review button will turn to review and submit. At that point, the student will see all of their responses highlighted, whether they are unanswered or answered, and I'll show you that in just a moment. And that's where they'll also be able to submit their test. Here's an example of that split screen control. So if you want to make the left or right pane larger, you can do that by just using the arrow, and it'll move that middle panel to the right or the left. And then all the different tools will show up here at the bottom of the page, your Zoom, bookmark notes, and then depending on what session, let's say if you're in a math test in a certain session, you might see a calculator. So all of your tools will be at the bottom of the page. Here's an example of the different tools based on the content that the student is taking, whether it's ELA or math. And here's an example of what the calculators look like. So for grade 6 session 2, students will see a 4-function calculator. And for grades 7 and 8, both sessions will have the scientific calculator. And as we spoke of earlier, the students can also have their school-provided calculator next to them on the table as well. These are examples of what the equation editors look like. So there are different equation editors based on grade band. So grades 3 to 4 is different than 5 to 6 versus 7 to 8. There are a couple of new buttons for each of those grade bands this year. Those are in the question sampler as well as the practice test. And then when the student gets to the end of the test and when they click that review and submit button, this is what, again, the review and submit box looks like. This is the point at which the proctor can come to the student's device and say, you didn't answer, let's say, number 2 and number 4, and they can point that out to them. If you click on each of these, so I click on unanswered, only the unanswered will be highlighted. If I click on answered, only the answered will be highlighted. So these are clickable fields. If the student is complete and they want to submit their test, then they click on submit. And at that point, they'll be asked one more time, are you sure? Then they would click on submit test. When they get to the end of the test, they'll just see a green check mark, you're done, and then you can click on the sign out button. In the instance where a student pauses their test, let's use the example of they needed to use the restroom during the test session, the student would click on that sign out or pause button in the upper right-hand corner of the test. When they do that, they'll see that there's this box pops up. Are you sure you want to pause your test and sign out? If they click pause test, it will sign them out of the test. It's important that your students also understand what cancel means, and they'll see cancel on different areas depending on what they're doing, but if they click on cancel, that would just bring them back to the test. So that's important that they understand that as well. And then when a student returns to their test, they will need to type in, the student will click on that icon again to launch the test delivery system. They'll then have to type in their NYSIS ID and password again. They'll also need that access code as they did prior, and then they'll be asked to enter the Proctor pin. And this is an example of what that Proctor pin window would look like. It just says Proctor pin needed. You need a Proctor pin to start or continue the test. At this point, you as the proctor would be going to that student's device with that information and typing it in for the student. This is secure materials, and it should not be provided to students for them to access on their own. So at that point, once they type in that information, then the student can resume testing. And that's about it for the student experience information. The next section that we're going to be talking about is what occurs after testing. So it's important that you as administrators, whether you be the teacher or proctor that's responsible for this or your school test coordinator, make sure that all your tests have been submitted. You can review the Nextera admin for confirmation. You can go right to that test page to make sure that you can see a submit next to and a complete next to each of your students. It's important to collect all materials, student login tickets, those reference sheets, any scratch paper that the student used. All materials must be securely destroyed at the end of each session. All teachers and proctors administering and scoring this test are not to discuss test questions or other specific test content with each other, with others online via email or through any other electronic means. And it's also important that you're reporting any irregularities and or misadministration. We will also be posting an educator survey. So Questar and ISED are gathering information from administrators participating in CBT. Their survey link will be on the homepage of Nextera admin and should be completed after the administration. This feedback is important as we plan for enhancements for the spring of 2019. And we thank you in advance for taking the time to tell us your feedback. And one final step is that proctor certificate. Don't forget to fill in the proctor certificate located in Appendix D of the School Administrator's Manual. Retain this in your school file for 1 year. And this acknowledges that the required administration procedures were followed. And now I'm going to pass the ball off to Heather as she's going to go through the tips and best practices.
Right, okay. So, and just to let you know, guys, we've got questions coming in fast and furious, and we are going to take a moment after a few slides from me to discuss all of those hot topics, okay? We've been writing them down. If we've not answered you, we will, and we will also allow some lucky folks to hold up their hand and ask us questions directly. Okay, Christine, next slide. Okay, so the best tip that we have and best practice that we learned from last year, and I've already said this, is that one thing that students noted during CBT is that there are fewer disruptions in the classroom. There was no, there wasn't the sound of paper turning. They didn't hear rulers dropping to the floor, and they really liked the fact that they could go around inside the test via the review screen instead of flipping through paper test booklets, right, when they were doing review. So what we offer is that if there are issues with a testing device, try to remove it from the classroom. Have the proctor walk it, to the door. Hopefully there are tech folks in the hallways on hand, which we have heard from every school that tested on CBT last year that they had tried to have technical colleagues on hand in cases such as if there was a mouse not working, maybe the Wi-Fi is not working. If not, one thing you can do is always check that Wi-Fi button, volume not working for a student who might be taking text-to-speech, or maybe the computer just won't turn on. So for those instances, try and limit disruption in the classroom and solve those issues out in the hallway, perhaps. All right, so here you can see, this is Chrissy's favorite tip about index cards, login tickets on index cards. Now, granted, this is my art. I did make these myself. I think you probably all guessed. You can print the login tickets on Avery labels and then affix them to index cards. But a great tip is for the school to have the students write the computer name at the bottom of the login ticket or on the back. This is a great tip for what if internet goes out, like a cable is cut and there's no internet in the district. for this reason, you're going to want those students to identify the computer that they're on. And we're going to get into that a little bit more about, internet going out, etc. So you can see here we've had Billy write down what iPad number he's testing on that day. And then what about students who might not be taking the test, but they're sitting in the testing location? You can have those students turn that index card over, write why they're not taking the test, such as taking Regents, have that student stand up, walk up to the proctor, hand the proctor that login ticket that has that not testing code indicated on the back of it, and then the student can leave the classroom and can go and do something else during that time if that's what your district has organized for the students. Okay. Another tip and best practice, again, these artifacts are created by me, by Scratch, that's my art, for Proctor pin. So the Proctor pin is a secure testing material that must be in the materials packet that's provided to proctors on the day of testing in that testing location. Well, we heard that a lot of schools, they actually put the Proctor pin on an index card. They made sure to indicate that it was a secure material, keep it turned over. But then when a student needed to re-enter the test, it was very easy to take that Proctor pin and walk over to the student's computer and type that pin into the student's keyboard, on the student's keyboard, to help that student get back into the test. Because we want to focus on fewer disruptions, we want to focus on efficiency, because all these things are possible with CBT. All right, so student testing accommodations. We see a lot of questions about form reset. What is a form reset? How are student testing accommodations assigned? So we'll go over that latter part a little later in our discussion. But first, we want to talk about testing accommodations. So once testing accommodations must be set by the school before a student logs into that test session. And there are reports on Nextera Admin that allow the schools to download and check and double check that all students have the accommodations that they need ahead of testing. So if a student is testing in a test session and maybe doesn't like the accommodation. So we had a great example from last year. Is there a student that maybe didn't like reverse contrast, right? But it was set for the student. I mean, the student's like, I just can't test. These are local decisions that you're discussing with the students, but say the decision is made to change that accommodation, to remove reverse contrast from that student's test, then you must call Questar to research a form reset. A form reset. So here's an example that I used in one of the answers to one of the attendees here in the webinar, is that you've got a student who sits down, they open up the test, and that student should have text-to-speech. As soon as that student logs in, you can see on screen, you're the proctor, that student doesn't have the robots. The text-to-speech player does not appear on the lower right of the student's test form. At that point, what's happened is that student has been served randomly one of the 21 other forms for ELA, right? There are 22 forms for ELA. There are 14 forms for math. You can see down there we have a little bullet for fun fact, more than 20 forms for ELA. So that student's been served one of the 21 other forms. So you have to, and that student, what if that student had entered 5 answers before it was realized that student needed text-to-speech? Hopefully this never happens, but when it does, you need to call Questar. Questar works with NICED, and then a form reset is resetting that student's account, setting the text-to-speech accommodation so that Form A is served to the student as it should be. But this is a 2 to 3 hour process during testing. So it's quite possible that that student may need to take session 1 on a makeup day, right? We don't want our students to be sitting and waiting. So think about, how you're going to organize that, check those accommodations, and work through the form reset. Now if a student is logged in, there's no text-to-speech player, yet the student hasn't started testing, the student probably won't, there's no answers that the student's going to lose. but still we lock down text-to-speech and read aloud by human reader and Nextera admin, so you still have to call Questar and NICED. And then the student, once the form reset has occurred, then there might be a password change. For text-to-speech and for read aloud by human reader, that password will change if a student has already logged into the test and needs the form reset. Okay? So it's and we did have instances last year of form resets. There weren't many, but you know, we've expanded to more than 650 schools this year. So we want our proctors to be checking those accommodations. Okay? Keyboard strokes. Keys work within the equation editor. So students can either, and you may get this question, right? So students can either use the equation editor function buttons, or they can use their keyboard to respond to the answer. As you can see here, now for those of you that are math experts out there, I did get my degrees in ELA. So I am no math genius, but these are my examples of the first response is answered using keyboard strokes. Notice that the student has already also typed in part of the response for the mathematical expression. And then the bottom example is entered completely with the equation editor function button. Students may use external headphones from home as long as those devices do not include recording software or transmitting software. We get so many questions about headphones. So keep this in mind. Yes, this is okay, but this should be arranged ahead of time with the school, between the school and the student. The school must inspect the hardware, right? And just as a reminder on that, students should only be using computers, iPads, external keyboards, and mice provided by the school. And that also includes handheld calculators. Okay. All right. Now here we've gotten some questions about this. So say you're a proctor and like you're noticing like all these students, they're just getting booted out of the test left and right. You are working your fingers off entering those proctor pins to get the students back in the test. There may be a problem. Your students should not be being booted out of the test because we provide tech tips to principals and to district test coordinators and STCs ahead of the CBT tests, and it's also in the Nextera setup and installation guide. System notifications must be turned off so that a student can test. The secure browser thinks that something else is going on the student's computer, and that something else could be triggered by a system notification, then the secure browser is secure. It locks down the secure browser, boots the student off of the test. Okay, and in Nextera admin, a proctor or a technical proctor who's watching the Nextera admin screen is going to see that the student is indicated as offline in Nextera admin. So if you're seeing this happen just so many times, think there may be a problem. Maybe system notifications weren't turned off for the school network. Or maybe you have an issue with student testing devices that are popping up the low battery indication. That will also boot a student out of the test. And this is one reason why we recommend having extra cords and power strips online. I mean, we've heard of instances where a school may have had just an issue with a certain testing device that had battery issues, right? It was hard to keep those batteries charged. So that's just, we're passing on our what we've learned to you. Okay? Wi-Fi problems. All right. So we know this is always a concern when testing on computer-based testing. But we want to remind you that students can continue taking the computer-based test in Nextera Secure Browser when there is no internet connection. An internet connection is necessary for the student to download the test. But once the student's testing, you'll see in this second example, if the Wi-Fi is blinking in and out, students can continue testing while offline, right? So, but consider if the internet goes down completely, and we have had these experiences where there were internet problems. Last year, maybe I believe a wire was cut at one district, and the internet was lost, as was the electricity, right? So students were logged into the test session, and they won't be able to submit the test. So if there's no internet connection, they're not going to be able to submit it. They will get a message. If there's a weak internet connection, like the Wi-Fi is blinking in and out, or there are too many students that are using a Wi-Fi connection, and the Wi-Fi is overloaded, then the test will just spin when the student clicks submit. You'll see a green spinny, okay? So that's how you'll know that whether or not there are Wi-Fi problems. But so in this example again, so the internet goes down, students were logged into the test session, they will not be able to submit the test. The students will pause the test, and then they must log back into that same computer when the internet is restored. And keep in mind, this is why we're advising you, it's a great best practice to have those students note on their login ticket what device they're using if it's not a one-to-one device situation, okay? All right, let's go ahead and open up. We've got a lot of hot topics. Clara, do you have a hot topic that you think we should address? Yes. Well, but we will again. I mean, this webinar is recorded. We understand that some of you have had some issues with hearing the audio. And tomorrow we're going to be doing our score point webinar. We'll advise folks to use your phone line, right? So sometimes when connecting through the webinar on your computer for audio, it's not exactly the best option. So it's recorded. It'll be on CBT support in the resources section by Friday morning.
So gang, is there anything that we want to?
Form A and test read, you want to go over that again?
I do. So again, all students that are testing on computer using either text to speech, where the robots speak to the students, read the test to the students, or read aloud by human, where the student has a human reading the test to her, but she's entering her responses on computer, they'll be testing on Form A. When principals ordered their tests through the NICEAD online examination request system, they indicated how many test read students they have. We don't make a differentiation between text to speech, human reader at the point of ordering. Principals are instructed via the ordering memo to indicate the number of students that make use of the test read accommodation. And so based on that, we send test read copies to the schools. So most schools, you will have your test read copies because we send 2 copies for every one indication that a principal entered into the ordering system. So if a school, and let's do some fun math here, fun math. Brian Sudicamp. So if a school ordered 4 test read copies, how many will they get?
They will get 8.
They will receive 8 because when one indication of test read is entered into the ordering system, we send 1 copy for the student and 1 copy for the reader. So most likely the schools will have additional test read Form A's paper copies on hand. Have plenty. I've got a question. So one question was, how do we account for ENL students, right? So alternate language, right? ENL is alternate language? Yes. Okay, just making sure, because I mean ELL.
English language learners.
Okay. Students testing in math for Chinese, Haitian Creole, Korean, Russian, and Spanish will be testing online with the alternate language form, meaning that if a student is testing in Chinese, the student will see Chinese on screen. The student will be provided with a paper English test copy. Because again, principals indicated how many students would be making use of an alternate language when they ordered tests, so we know to ship Form A test read bundles to that school. Okay, and the accommodations, and alternate languages, they're handled like accommodations in Nextera admin. There is an article on CBT support now that shows how one would select testing language Spanish, for instance, and then see that Spanish pops up, as an accessibility feature for that student for testing day. And additionally, this information and screenshots are in Appendix Y of the SAM, Appendix Y.
Where can I get NICES ID numbers if we have to add students?
That's a great question. All right, so NICES ID numbers. First of all, I want to remind all schools that our first tier level of support out there are your RICs. Your regional information center testing departments, they've lived through this before and they have all your answers. But additionally, they can help you with access to the NICES ID app. So the NICES ID app is in the business portal, the NICES business portal, and most district data coordinators should have access to that application to be able to look up NICES IDs. But then again, your RIC may know the student's NICES ID or the district data coordinator. Okay, the NICES IDs are entered into the SME. All students have a NICES ID associated to them at L2 for the data to be able to travel, the student data to be able to travel to the level 2 data warehouse in Buffalo. Great question. I want to go over the differences between an access code and the Proctor pin. So when students are in the classroom and they're getting ready to take the computer-based test, the first thing the student is going to do is the student's going to look at their login ticket. They're going to type in their NICES ID into the secure browser login screen. They're going to type in their password. They're going to enter the test. At that point, the student and the teacher or the proctor, they're going to go through the teacher's directions. And they're going to learn a little bit more, make sure that the students understand exactly how they're going to be taking the test that day. Then the teacher, the proctor, is going to read the 4-digit access code to the students. And then, while a student is testing, a student gets up and has to go to the bathroom, for instance, the student pauses the test, goes to the bathroom with their proctor chaperone, comes back, and then the proctor in the classroom is going to use the proctor pin to assist the student to get back in the test. The student's going to log back into the test as she did in the beginning of the day. She's going to enter her NICES ID, her username. She's then going to enter the access code. And then at that point, a pop-up comes up for the proctor pin. And the proctor then will physically type the proctor pin into the keyboard for the student to enter the test. Okay. What else we got? Anybody? Any good questions out there? Do we want to open it up, Christy? Hands up.
We surely can.
Let's do that.
So, who wants to be our first live question? I have a lot of hands right. Hold on. I'm going to start with not raising anybody's hands. Let's start that way. So, if you have a question, hold on. Is there a way to unraise people's hands?
Okay. Are you unraising?
I'm unraising, so give me a second. I'm going to unraise.
We're going to tell you when you can raise, and then you might be picked.
There's quite a few.
One lucky.
I think it was from one of our questions before.
Lucky attendee will be picked live here today. That's right, folks.
Okay, nobody's hands are raised. If you would have a question that you would like to ask live, please raise your hand and I will unmute your line. So let's start. Oh boy, we got a lot.
Really? That's great.
Let's start with, I can't even get to it because it keeps moving. Megan Gildia, unmuted your line.
Hi, Megan. What do you have for us?
I work at a BOCES program, and a lot of my students' IEPs, the accommodation just says tests read. Is it up to us to determine whether it's a human reader or text-to-speech?
Yes, it is. It's up to you and the CSE. So the student should be taking the practice test. You should be working with the CSE, and you should be determining what is the most appropriate way to deliver that test-read accommodation to the student.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, good question. Thank you. Next,
I'm going to go with Nicole Whitehead.
Hi, what do you got?
Hi, can we give them physical copies of the math reference sheet?
Oh, great question. Yes, you can. And Questar is going to ship those directly to you just for asking that today. Now, all schools will get print reference sheets this year. But we do want, this is a great time to note that there is an improvement in the NextEra test delivery system over last year's reference sheet. Last year's reference sheet was static and it couldn't be moved around. This year, the reference sheet does all sorts of clicky and movey things as it should, and it can be resized and moved around on screen by the student. However, we're still providing the paper reference sheet to our students this year. Good question.
Thank you.
Let's go with Deb Lysek, and I apologize if I butchered your name.
Hi, Debbie. I know Debbie. Hello. What do you got? Did you unmute her?
I did.
Okay.
Deb Lysek. All right,
Debbie.
moving on. We are going to take David Doe.
Hi, David.
Hi.
How can we? Hello?
When I ordered, we decided our grades 3 through 6 will do all CBT. I did not put down test read. Will we have a Form A just in case we need to have the teacher read it?
Okay. What you need to do is you need to submit an additional materials order to Questar. If you go to CBT support and you search on the phrase paper test, we've got an FAQ out there to answer the question, how do I order additional paper tests for my CBT grade level? Yes, Clara?
They should have a student in mind for this and just not order extra materials to have.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, count your students.
You need to know what you're doing ahead of time.
Yeah. And David, what school are you from? 'Cause
Morristown.
Morristown? All right. We'll also make sure and confirm that for you too, that you indeed didn't enter any test read. Okay.
I didn't. I was just on the SCD portal.
Oh, look at you. Good job. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, so look up that additional materials order, count your students, and Questar will ship additional materials orders up into 1 week before the test. So if you get into April, it's too late. At that point, schools will need to go to the regional centers to pick up on the day of each test session. So call them now. Okay.
All right, we can do a couple more. I'm going to go with Susan Weeks.
Hi, Susan.
Hi, how are ya?
Good. What can we help with?
How's the accommodation of answers recorded implemented?
Oh, there's an FAQ out on CBT support that indicates how you would use of Scribe as a testing accommodation with CBT. So,
Okay.
and just, to answer you specifically, it's the same process as with paper. So the student is writing, the student is speaking her response to the scribe. The scribe is writing that response on a piece of paper, sliding that piece of paper over to the student. The student is confirming, yes, indeed, that is my response. And then the scribe is typing that response into the computer, the NextEra test delivery system. Now, we get often asked, well, should the student review that again on computer? Sure, but that's our process only goes as far as to, provide guidance on getting that response into the computer. There's no reason that you would not allow a student to review what's on screen, right? Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
What do you got, Christy?
Did we talk about non-tested codes yet?
Ooh, that's a good one. Okay. All right. So not tested codes. So when we showed the login tickets earlier, we showed an example of a student who was sitting for the test. They were in the CBT classroom, but was actually going to be taking the Regents exam. So this is during math. This was an 8th grade student. And so that student gets up, hands the login ticket to the proctor on the way out with that not tested code. Not testing codes can be entered for students. You can organize them either ahead of testing if you know, for instance, that you may have a medically excused student, or you can organize and set those after testing has completed for that test session. We'll send reminders to principals and to district test coordinators. Our RICs will also help us with this to make sure that folks are setting not tested codes for those students in NextEra admin. For every student that is in Nextera admin and will not be testing in that CBT grade level, they should have a not tested code set for them in Nextera admin. It just makes it simpler to be able to identify and look for, hunt down paper tests, for instance, because there is a test code for testing on paper, for instance. The not tested codes are the same on computer as those not tested codes that are on the paper answer sheets. But I will tell you that testing on paper is the only CBT only code, and there is an article out on CBT support with documentation and steps for how to set not testing codes. So you can go and review those now. All right, so Christy says we have time for one more question.
We will, I'll take it from Lynn Brown. Lynn, are you there? Okay. Then we'll try Daniel Brown. Are you there?
Oh, okay.
Hello. I'm from Carmel Central School District, and I'm just questioning, and I think you might have just addressed it, for students with an IEP who will be testing on paper as opposed to the computer. We have ordered the test read, getting 2 copies, but is there a not testing code for that?
No, that's great, and that's exactly it. So you've got a student that's taking test read on a paper booklet, because I just want to remind everybody, you will have instances in almost any CBT grade level, the chance that a student is testing on paper due to IEP accommodations or say oral translation in an alternate language such as French or Japanese, that we don't have paper or computer-based tests for math for the students. So that student's going to test on paper, and you will mark the student as testing on paper with a not tested code. And I want to make sure that folks have seen the memo that went out earlier this week about students. So students that are testing on computer, and say your test window begins on April 10th. Did I get the date right? I'm so bad with dates. The first day of the CBT test window, where we know that Tuesday, the PBT test window doesn't start until Wednesday. Yes, you can break the seal on those paper tests, and students that are in a CBT grade level can test at the same time on paper as their CBT peers. Okay, so, and we'll be posting, I'll be sharing the memo on CBT support and noting it in the CBT listserv this Friday. Okay. All right, so we're gonna wrap it up. So how do you subscribe to the CBT listserv? Go out to CBT support and search on listserv. That's LISTSERV. There's no E on it, it's one word. And we do try to send news every Friday about new events on CBT. And if you have any questions, contact your Rick or contact us. What? Oh, the FAQ, that's great. So all the questions that you have been sending in, we will download those and we will create an FAQ where we provide the answer, and then we provide additional supporting materials if any exist, links to materials. This is a great resource. It does take us about a week to 2 weeks to complete the FAQ. We'll try to speed it up. We know that ELA is starting soon. But if you want to see an example of that, we recommend that you look for the Q&A from the winter statewide webinar. And there's some of your answers may already be there. This is an extensive document that we posted on CBT support. But that's it. Okay. Thanks, Christy.
Thanks, everybody.